Okay, the webinar is now being recorded.
Okay. Hello, everyone. How are you? Oh, you're on mute. As James said, my name is James. I'm a case manager with Boston Healthcare for the Homeless. And we're going to be talking today about housing. And when we were talking about sort of the general structure of this get-together, we had a lot of different options, and I just want to make sure that people feel comfortable typing in questions or comments. I do a fair amount of housing work in my role as case manager, but so do you. And even for people who have the title of housing advocate, no one person holds all the information. So really this get-together is about comparing notes and seeing what some of the similarities and differences are and challenges of not only obtaining but maintaining housing. Anyone can get a roof over their head, but what we're going for is something a little deeper and a little more meaningful and a little more supportive. So in your roles, I assume that you meet with either patients or clients that you're already familiar with who need housing, or it might be someone that you've never met before who presents and identifies the need for housing. I think either way, and because I'm a huge fan of asking the obvious, I would ask the person, what are you looking for? What does housing mean to you? Because I think if you ask this question enough times, you'll find that it means something different for everyone. And some people may say, I'm tired of being homeless, and I really want a home. I have these specific, I want to live with my girlfriend or boyfriend, or I want to invite family back into my life, and other people may just say, I want a roof over my head. I'm just going to be sleeping there. I'm out most of the day. I don't need anything fancy. So it's really important to accommodate, to really hear what the person's saying and then do your best to accommodate them. And what you're usually doing with this is you're balancing what their desires are with what's available. And that can be such a moving target. So I think the first part is to really sit down and just say, what are you looking for and how can I help you? Because in order for housing to be successful, your patient has to be as comfortable as possible in that housing, whether it is just a roof over their head or it's something a little bit more substantial. So communication, very important, and you may find that you do a lot of talking before you really identify the type of housing that they want, or you may find that you do a lot of talking before they're able to really identify what it is that they're looking for, because thinking about housing requires a certain amount of mindfulness, introspection. It really involves examining a lot of details of your life, and for some patients, either there's a lot of chaos and this is harder for them to do, or it's just not something that they're used to. Then again, you may have someone that walks in, they know exactly what they want, they've done a lot of thinking about it. So the interesting thing is that there are so many different potential scenarios that you could encounter. I think one important question to ask someone is, is HIV-specific housing something, is it an option, is it something you're interested in? I mean, I think it's a question of whether it exists in your communities, and then whether the person would feel comfortable with it. In some cases, people say, you know what, totally cool with it. I think it would be good for me to be around people with, some of the same challenges. I think people might say it would be important for me to be around other people who are HIV positive so I can learn from them and so I can share my experiences. And other people might say, I'm not out about my status, or I'm not comfortable, or I don't want to live in housing that will identify me as HIV positive. If it's this latter one, I mean, is it an opportunity to refer to behavioral health services to discuss stigma or disclosure issues? Someone may be totally out about their status or cool with it and still not want HIV-specific housing, and that's fine. But I think at least in Boston, as the housing market gets weirder and weirder, I think that some of the Ryan White housing is some of the how would I say this? I think it's some of the easiest housing to obtain because so many people are excluded from it by their HIV, by being HIV negative. And I think that funding, I could be wrong, seems pretty stable for now. So I mean, I personally have had more luck getting people into the Ryan White housing, and we do have a lot of Ryan White housing in Boston. But again, I don't know what it's like in San Diego or North Carolina or some of the other locations. I think when you're talking with the patients about housing, I think it's really important to consider sort of what our goals are versus what their goals are. Sometimes I've had patients say to me, I don't want to be housed. And I've had patients say, I want to be housed, but I don't feel like now is the time. And I've also had patients really want to be housed, but they've had a hard time sort of accomplishing that because of circumstances in their life. So I think you have to sort of, there's a certain amount of managing of our own expectations. Like you never want to want housing more than the patient. You sort of want to match them. You never want to work harder than them. Again, you want to match them. I think I've had patients where, they swore up and down they wanted housing, but there was just sort of, missing a lot of appointments, sort of, not great follow-through. And if that's the case, there might be other things going on in their life. And I think it's really important, if you have a good working relationship, to be able to talk to them about all the different things going on in their life that might be affecting their ability to show up for appointments or sort of, do the housing work. I think it's fine to say, it sounds like there's a lot of craziness going on, or it sounds like maybe sort of this other issue is your main focus right now. We can do a little bit of work on that housing, but maybe put on the back burner for a little bit, if you feel that's appropriate. But again, it's sort of, you ask the person and see what they say, and if they say no, I'm totally into it, then you sort of forge ahead. But at least where I work and with the patients I work with, I have a fairly good working relationship with most of them. And I don't really have a problem saying, I can't help but notice ... If someone does miss repeated appointments, and then I follow it up by saying, is there something I can do to help with this? I mean, you always want to be supportive. If it's something as simple as a transportation issue, or, it's always harder. Money's always an issue. Transportation's always an issue. If it's something as simple as that, I mean, we have fixes for that at our clinic. I mean, we can help with transportation or apply to places that provide transportation. If it's really something much larger, then it's a good opportunity to really discuss it and help the person work on sort of prioritizing and scheduling issues. No. Oh yeah. Oh, and about defining roles. So I mean, I'm fairly upfront with my patients in terms of saying, so how do it's your housing and you will be taking the lead, but we have a number of different ways that we can do this. How do you want to work it? I think that in developing a working relationship, especially with a patient you've never, have no previous experience with, I think the secondary gain is that you can learn a lot about the person, sort of understand their style. Because housing is sort of part of the picture, and for most clients that I've worked with, it's usually one of the first things they mention when I say, what are you looking for? What are our case management goals? But it's certainly not the entire picture. And it's important for patients to understand that even, after they're housed, I mean, there will be a lot more work to do. So again, I think I've said this in the previous webinar, it's like I don't think of housing as it is a finish line of sorts, but it allows you to really sort of concentrate on other areas of their life that might sort of need some organization. And also I think every interaction with a patient is unique. I mean, if you find that you're going into a meeting with a patient or a client sort of thinking how they're going to react or what they're going to say, it might be time for you to sort of just remind yourself that clients can always surprise you in the best way possible, and to sort of give them that benefit. So before I get up from my desk to go meet with a client, I just sort of clear my mind. I say, okay, clear the decks and sort of approach this. And really maintain a consistency of attitude in terms of being supportive and encouraging and strengths perspective based. There's stuff that our patients pick up on that you may not, you wouldn't think that they'd notice it, but patients are and clients are insanely perceptive on all levels. And even if you go into a meeting with a headache or not feeling well, they'll pick up on it on some level. I mean, may even say something to you. I've certainly had patients say things to me. But the focus should be on the patient and sort of their needs, and it's their time, and they're the focus. Next slide. So if and when you work with people on the housing search process, invariably you're going to end up calling or interviewing in person for housing. And it's important, I mean, in the same way that that patients and clients read our tone of voice, word use, body language, it's the same when they're interviewing for housing. So it's really important to just really, as much as possible, prepare ahead of time in terms of how to make the best impression possible. Because I think usually that first meeting and the first 5 minutes is really where things sort of come together, and you want that to be as strong as possible. I've worked with patients, that I've successfully housed, and it was because we worked on this, and they just made a really great impression. I think, if you think about what landlords want, really they want someone who's going to pay their rent, be respectful, not invite tons of people into the apartment and create, that's all that they want. If you give them that, they're very, very happy. I mean, they really just sort of want the rent, and they want order and stability. I think most of the people that will be housing will be living in buildings with other people. And I think for landlords or property managers, managing these large buildings with a lot of different things going on in them, it's a very, very, very challenging scenario. So anything you can do to sort of like stay under their radar is great. And the other thing I remind my patients of is when you're calling, they can't see you. They don't know who you are. They only know what you choose to disclose, and and that is empowering. I myself, as you can tell, suffer from stage fright, even on the phone, and it can be very nerve-wracking to call someone that you don't know and ask for something. And in this case, you're asking for housing, because I think rejection, even if it's from a landlord that's never met you, who says, "I'm sorry, we don't have any apartments available right now," that can, for certain patients and clients, that can feel disempowering. So, it's important after the calls to really sort of debrief with the person. I mean, if they don't have room, they don't have room. But there's always follow-up questions you can ask, like, do you expect any vacancies soon? And I've had plenty of landlords say, well, actually, there's a couple people on their way out, call back next month. And it's worked out fine. But I think you really have to be clear beforehand about sort of, making a really strong impression, and then asking sort of these routine, appropriate questions to get information, and then scheduling in the callbacks if it looks like they're going to have something in a month or two. I talk to my patients a lot about role-playing, or sort of this community theater concept where you are adopting a persona, and the persona that you're adopting is like the best tenant in the world. And the key is to really just sort of, strive for a natural performance. And I think a lot of this involves pointing out the patient's strengths that you've observed in working with them. Our patients, without exception, are some of the most resourceful, intelligent people on the planet. So it's not like they don't have the skills. They just need sort of the support and encouragement. I had one patient in particular who I housed, and we talked about this idea of role playing. She went in and she nailed it. She was great. She didn't talk too much. She didn't talk too little. She gave great sort of answers, but not too much information. She stayed on topic. But I think that she really needed that reminder about, you might be nervous in this situation. Just sort of think about what you're saying, pace yourself. Don't, tell them what they need, but you're not required to give them more. information than what they're asking. Because out of giving them sort of what they're asking and not too much information, the landlord may ask for additional information before you know it, you have a conversation going, and that can be a good thing. Next slide. Am I going too fast here? I can't even tell. Well, I'll soldier on. And also, I think it's really important to, when, with defining the working roles, I mean, it's definitely important to say, this is your housing. As a case manager, housing advocate, I work for you. This is your time, it's your journey, and I am definitely playing a supporting role, but it really is all about them and their needs. And as a result, they'll be doing sort of more of the heavy lifting than we will, but then they also get to sort of reap the rewards, which is, affordable, hopefully, affordable, comfortable, long-term housing. I think it's really important to talk to patients and find out what they know about commonly used housing abbreviations, commonly used housing terms. I mean, like anything else, it really is a language unto itself. And I think people that do a lot of housing work on a regular basis learn these terms. But a lot of them, like, why would anyone necessarily know what an SRO is? Unless you say, SRO, that's a single room occupancy. Usually these are shared bathrooms or shared kitchens, but not always. You really, part of your job is to sort of be an interpreter, not only interpreting sort of the details of the housing, but also, if you meet with a landlord or property manager or even real estate agent, to sort of define what the subtext of the conversation was after the meeting, or sort of refresh or remind what the goals are going into the meeting. So, as I said earlier, I think a strengths perspective is best in terms of supporting the patient. And I think it's also important to know when to ground the patient. Even today, I was talking with a patient who said, oh, I got this paperwork about this apartment in Charlestown. I'm going to take it. I don't even need to look at it. I just want to get in somewhere. And I think especially for people that haven't been housed in a very, very long time, or people who are very, very anxious around housing, there's this impulse to sort of grab the first thing that comes along. But if there's any sort of cardinal rules of housing, one of them would definitely be don't take a place without setting eyes on it. But sometimes people do. And if this person said, I said, I'm happy to go with you to look at it. It's great that you're on the list and that your name is coming up very soon. But let's look at it together and see what we think. It sounds great. I just want to make sure it is great. And he totally understood that, and he asked if I could go with him, and I said I absolutely can. And so it avoided this person the heartache of moving into a place that could be a potential nightmare. And I think it's also important to help patients or clients know, manage expectations. Sometimes housing can be kind of piecemeal. So if they're going into like a long-term program until they can get into long-term housing, you really want them to understand the concept that they may have to go, it's required they go to meetings. Or if they're moving into an SRO with a shared kitchen or a shared bathroom, you just really want to talk to them about what that means for them, with the understanding they'll eventually graduate to better housing. You don't want someone walking into a situation where they didn't really understand what they were signing up for. So exploring the details of the housing from all different angles is really, really important. And I think for me, one of the biggest challenges that my patients have had is they've obtained really wonderful housing, and sometimes with really crappy neighbors. Patients have to understand they're moving into an apartment, sometimes within a house or a building, within a neighborhood, and there can be problems within any one of those areas. And sometimes it's very manageable if you talk about it, sort of figure out a strategy. But sometimes it can be a real problem. I mean, aside from developing a really good rapport with property management and sort of like really being methodical about reporting when neighbors are being inappropriate or causing problems, and talking to property management about this, it's hard. It's a moving target. But I think in terms of discussing housing, sort of either generally or specifically, I think it's important to state the obvious. I think it's important to ask the obvious, and I think it's really important to encourage the patients and clients to do the same. You really want everything out there in the open so that there are no surprises, unexpected surprises. And I think because each patient is different, and because housing in most markets is really, really tricky, if you're looking at housing that is really far away from their hospital or health center, really far away from their family or friends or supports, I think you really want to talk to the patient about sort of being isolated versus a fresh start. In some cases, I've had patients say, you know what, I like that I'm moving somewhere remote because no one knows me and I get to sort of reinvent myself. I'm not going to run into people that I know from my, I don't have to worry about running into people that might cause me problems that I know, And then other patients, it's a real problem if they're too far away from their church or their family or their health center. Sometimes a patient's support system is the only thing keeping them sane. So you never want to remove that from them. So, you talk to them, you just say, you find out what their social supports are, and then sort of will they have access to them? And if they don't have access to their social supports, is it possible to build new social supports? And transportation, again, is always an issue. You want people to be able to access food, laundry, other necessities. And you want patients and clients to be able to travel to medical appointments. And not just to see their doctor or nurse, but also behavioral health. Methadone clinic is a huge one, Suboxone clinic. I think a lot of that comes, you find a lot of the information when you sit down and you find out who their social supports are and make a list of that. You'll kind of know what you're dealing with. Again, we have an obligation as case managers and patient navigators and housing advocates to help the patient obtain affordable, comfortable, long-term housing. And you never want to do anything to set your patient up to fail. You want to keep in mind your patient's physical and psychological health. And you really want to be mindful of accessibility issues. I mean, if someone has COPD, you definitely don't want them walking up 5 flights of stairs. You can work with a nurse, or if you have access to the information, sort of really look at their problem list. Some of the issues they're dealing with medically, and take that into consideration. Housing may already be fitted with some of the accommodations that you need, but I don't think that you should be afraid to request them from the landlord or the property manager. And then you want to think about what additional supports the patient requires and arrange ahead of time. So visiting nurse, assistance with activities of daily living, Meals on Wheels programs, medical supplies like shower chairs, railings in the shower, nutritional supplements like Ensure. I mean, you want to do that ahead of time. You don't want to wait until the person's in there and say, oh yeah, I need to ask for this, that, or the other, because if the person can't get in or out of their apartment, it's going to be bad. I think another big part of it is just making sure that you're available, either by pager or phone, either cell phone or desk phone. For some of these patients that you're working with, you may be their primary support. And you want to make sure also that you're able to visit them regularly, reliably, and safely. And in terms of needing for housing, I mean, it's something that you want to do regularly before the person's housed. But I think when a person moves into housing is sort of the best time to start working on just continue working on housing and really sort of take it to the next level. I think it's okay to take a little bit of time while they settle in and get comfortable in their housing, but I don't think you want to, I don't think you want to wait until the lease is almost up to sort of start looking for the new housing. And it helps keep the momentum going, and I think sometimes when patients are housed, There's a cooling off period, and I think sometimes patients can feel neglected sometimes. I always ask patients for their permission to remind them about things that we've discussed and to challenge them on things. I would never sort of out of the blue challenge a patient, but if I, like, say I feel they need a payee, or say I feel a payee is a good idea, and they don't, I say that's totally cool. Is it all right if I just sort of bring this up from time to time and we can talk about it? And if they give you permission, then you can bring it up from time to time, especially if they're really struggling and it's clear that they could use a payee. You can bring it up and say, I know we talked about this before, you gave me permission, I'm going to ask you about this now, don't be mad at me. And they won't, because I think they appreciate the concern. So with housing, or part of the housing process, I mean, you're invariably, the criminal record is going to come up as an issue, and credit may come up as an issue. With the criminal record report, here we call them queries, I don't know what you call them in your area. It's always a great idea to obtain a copy of the criminal record and review it together. Sit down and just make sure the patient understands that there's no judgment involved, but really landlords, housing authorities may be looking at this, so it's important that you look at it also to sort of see what's on there. I think sometimes patients are surprised by what is or isn't on there, and having all that information in one place can be, it can be overwhelming, but it can also in some cases be enlightening. First and foremost, all open cases must be addressed. I think it's very rare that someone could obtain housing without closing any cases that are open. But when you're looking at the criminal record, you really want to think of, look at patterns of behavior, and think about how that could affect housing and discuss with the patient. And you also want to be thinking about whether sort of, are some crimes worse than others. I think that a history of speeding tickets is much different than the history of attempted armed robbery. But even if you sort of focus in, I think that dealing drugs outside of a school zone is very different than dealing drugs inside of a school zone. So you really want to look at the specific charges, and again, you don't want the patient to feel like they're on trial, but you want to give them a chance to sort of explain the circumstances. And you don't have to do this all in one meeting. You can sort of break it up, because I think that any discussion of the past, even if it's just the criminal record, is going to stir up a lot of emotions. And again, I think at our clinic, discussing behavioral health is a real challenge because people hear mental health and it has a lot of stigma attached to it. The way that I pitch it is, the housing process is stressful. Even when it goes well, it's stressful. So having someone to talk to sort of just talk about some of the stress, some of the stressors and how that affects you, I mean, I think that's a good thing. I've never been a fan of mental health or behavioral health. It implies there's something wrong with the person. And I think for a lot of people who are encouraged to access these services, that's usually how they feel also, that they're being labeled or stigmatized. But I think anything you can do to sort of get some additional support on board is always great. And also, the great thing about our patients is that they've been through so much. They've been through so much and they've changed over time. So the criminal record sort of tells you what the person's been through. It's a record of their experiences, but it is by no means an indication of who they are as individuals. And some landlords really, really do understand this. I've worked with landlords who will meet someone and say, I just like him, I really want to house him, I think he'll be really good. They go by feel. And even if there's stuff on the criminal record that is a little bit challenging, they'll say, you know what, it's fine, we'll work with him. Other landlords totally go by what is on the record and what is on the record only, and it really varies from landlord to landlord. And also I think it's important to find out what legal resources are in your area. And even if there are lots of legal resources in your area, you really want to make sure that you have a legal representative who is experienced in housing law or mitigating mitigating housing denials. It's a very specific area, but those lawyers are out there, and sometimes it involves a little bit of networking to find the right person. And then with the credit report, financial literacy and sort of educating patients on what credit is can definitely lead to better credit. In fact, I think for places that can afford to do it, I think having support groups for people that are working on housing is a really great idea, because this is a good thing to discuss in support groups like that. And in some places, credit may not be an issue at all, and in other places, it can definitely. I've had people denied because of their credit history, and I don't think a lot of our patients understand that no credit can sometimes be as bad as bad credit. So if there are credit counseling resources in your area, that's definitely a good thing. And you can work with your patient on helping them repair their credit or improve their credit or build good credit. It's very, very doable. Next slide. So in terms of housing search, I think this is the part that probably takes the most time. A lot of different places to look for housing. I have them listed on the slide. Newspapers, flyers in the neighborhood, laundromats, word of mouth. Our two housing authorities post apartments, or available apartments, every Friday morning, online, through local churches, other community connections. And it really is kind of hit or miss. In terms of searching with a patient, I think a lot of it depends on whether the patient has any sort of computer literacy themselves. So if you can meet with a patient once or twice or 3 times a week for half an hour to do housing search, and then they're able to go to the local library and do search on their own, that's great. I think it takes a little bit longer when the person is not so experienced with computers. But it's surprising. I always encourage people to really ask people that they know, and in some cases strangers, about available housing. It's surprising what word of mouth can do. So if they're at another agency and they're meeting with someone and say, hey, by the way, I'm looking for housing. Do you know of anything, or have you heard of anything? Or if you hear of anything, could you call me? Or if you hear of anything, could you call my case manager? It's surprising. We have found a lot of housing that way. Sometimes there are apartments or housing situations that don't get posted online, or flyers don't get made. People really want sort of like a word of mouth kind of thing. So that's another way to find housing. In terms of finding furnishings or maybe rental assistance or funds to help with housing, thrift stores, retail outlets, co-workers, family, friends, neighbors, online resources like Craigslist, FreeCycle, other organizations. Again, mixed results. I think that if you're going to call a church, I think it's important. When you talk to someone about their social supports, church may definitely come up. And if you're going to call a church to ask for donations or help with rental assistance, then I think you definitely want to call the church that they belong to. But I think it's perfectly fine to call a church in their soon-to-be neighborhood and say, I'm a case manager. I work with someone in your community who needs some help with rent. Do you currently have funds available? You're not disclosing anything about the individual, and that way, and you're not giving the whole story. And that way, if they say, sorry, we're out of funds right now, you haven't wasted 10 minutes explaining this very complex situation. Also, it's fine to have if the patient feels comfortable calling, they could call a church and say, hey, I live in your community, and I'm in need of some help. Do you have any funds? But again, you'd want to ask those follow-up questions, such as, oh, well, I understand that you don't have any funds right now. Do you expect to have any soon? And they may say, well, the end of the quarter is coming up. At the beginning of next quarter, we will have money, and you should call us back. You definitely want to work those connections. And I think with looking for online resources, especially when it comes to furnishing apartments, I don't know if some of your sites are the same as ours, but be really careful about free, like with sites like FreeCycle, where people leave stuff out on the curb and you go pick it up. The last thing that you want is any sort of infestation, bed bugs, fleas, or otherwise. I would really discourage people from getting resources like beds or anything with wooden frames off of the street. I think I would pursue other avenues for things like beds. And then you want to find out about discounted utility rates in your area. Our service carriers, NSTAR and National Grid, do have discounted rates for disabled people. It's pretty easy. You do it through your doctor's office, and there's no disclosure around HIV status. The doctor is just verifying that the individual is disabled. Utilities assistance programs, again, same thing, discount phone plans, discounted cable plans. I mentioned this to one of my coworkers, and she was indignant that there would be such a thing as discounted cable plans. But when we're thinking about our patients being housed, we really are taking a harm reduction model. Here in New England, where it's snowy for 10 months out of the year, you want, if people have to be indoors, you want them maybe watching cable TV instead of trying to brave the elements when they shouldn't be, or just at home feeling so bored and isolated that they're tearing their hair out. So I'm all for discounted cable plans myself. It's my 2 cents worth. The housing paperwork process. Again, when you're talking about managing your own expectations, there's also a part of it about managing the patient's expectations. Definitely encourage, remind them, pace yourself. It says here, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Housing is always a process. It always requires more paperwork than you imagine. It always takes a little bit longer than you imagine. But especially when patients are so close to housing, they get so anxious and they just want it. But if you take time and really stage it properly, it will be more rewarding for them, and you really just need to keep reminding them of that. It's mentally and physically exhausting for case managers as well as patients. And just, prepare the patient for the task at hand. I mean, during the first meeting, just sort of lay it out and say it's hard. Even when it goes smoothly, it's challenging. And also, if you sort of take the housing in sort of bite-sized pieces, you're less likely to get overwhelmed. Again, you're coming back to this idea of baby steps. And always acknowledge the patient's accomplishments. I think that if you get even a little bit into housing, you can turn to your patient and say, look, 3 months ago we had not done X, Y, and Z, and we've done all of those things now. And it's because you showed up for appointments and you did the work, and you have to take a minute and give yourself credit for that. Because without their willing participation, none of it means anything. So definitely, acknowledge the hard work. You'll have patients say, I feel as though I'm just filling out the same application again and again and again. And that's exactly true, because a lot of the landlords and property managers and real estate agents who will be reviewing these applications, they want the same information. And sometimes, especially for some of the Ryan White housing opportunities, they use the same applications, these universal HIV and AIDS housing applications. So it is literally the same application over and over and over again. But they do need the pen and ink originals. And there might be slightly different information on each application. So you never want to fill out one and then just Xerox it and spit it out into the universe. And again, the mathematics of housing is the more applications you fill out, the more housing choices that you'll have. And again, you have to just keep reminding the patient of this, and sympathize that it is a lot of work, and but that it's for a purpose, and that it will help lead you to this housing. Also, you want to start building dual files for yourself and the patient of any applications that are done. And in some cases, the patient may say, I really don't want to carry this paperwork around, especially if they're applying for HIV-specific housing. You know, it discloses their status. I don't want to carry it around. I'm in the shelter. Or so-and-so, you know, someone might look in my bag and find that's fine. We can keep it, you know, in our offices under lock and key, and they can come in and we can access the file. But really, make sure that you don't submit that housing application without keeping a copy for yourself and for the patient. And I think the secondary gain is that in helping the patient organize their paperwork and helping them sort of organize their social supports and organize sort of your method of working together, you're modeling how to organize things, and patients will pick up on some of that. I think they learn from us in the same way that we learn from them. And then there's the question of releases of information, which is, you know, can be a real hot spot. I think if a patient were going to, if you're turning in a housing application, I don't think that you need to have the patient sign a release unless you're going to be the one calling up to follow up on it. But I think that if it looks likely, I think the housing at a particular site looks very likely. I think it'd be very important to have a release because, you know, we're the ones that provide the backup. We're the ones that advocate for our patients. We can't do that legally unless we have a release. So at least in Massachusetts, if say we house someone, they didn't want to sign a release, landlord calls me screaming and yelling, I can't even acknowledge that I know the person. I'm not allowed to disclose anything, not even that I work with them. And even if I'm listed on the application, I cannot discuss any details. And it might be what the patient needs most. So hopefully your patient will say, you know what, you know, I'll sign the release, and then you can talk about sort of what you would be using the release for and really be clear on the terms. A release is not permission to disclose lots of miscellaneous information about a person. It's usually specifically for the purposes of housing advocacy and case management. Anything outside of that specifically is irrelevant and should not be discussed. And I think if the patients understand that, and if you ask them sort of, you know, if you're going to be collaborating, tell me how you'd like me to sort of, in what style or what information you'd like me to, you know, disclose to the landlord if he calls and we're talking. You know, put it up front and discuss it, and then there'll be no misunderstandings. But also having releases. So when you do the, you know, that sort of initial intake where you're talking to the person about housing, I mean, I think these releases are important for talking about work that they may have done with previous service providers. If someone moves from another state, like say they move from Oregon to Boston, I mean, it's obvious why they're not working with the same case manager. But if it's someone in the same city or it's an agency nearby, like why, you know, especially if they've got housing work with them, why aren't they working with them? Sometimes there can be an interesting story behind that. Sometimes it's just a preference. And in some cases, especially if the patient lost the housing that he or she was placed into, there can be so much internalized stigma or shame that maybe they feel like they can't go back to that housing advocate. But if the person has a long and rich and rewarding housing history with that person, you know, and they're okay with you bringing them into the mix, I think it's a good thing. Or at the very least to maybe contact that agency with the patient's permission and find out sort of more details about what happened in that housing. How am I doing for time? Wow, we're miles away. Is everyone doing okay out there? All right, I'll assume yes. Where are we? Oh yeah. Oh, so speaking of this HIV and AIDS Universal Housing Form, I took this page from that, and this is their 5-year housing history, and this is very similar to what most patients will be filling out in any housing application that they do. In some cases, you'll see it listed as, you know, list your last 3 housing situations. But it's the same information, landlord or property management, contact information, and how long were you there. So if during that first meeting to sort of get the patient used to filling out paperwork, if you sit down with them and complete this form, you will have this on file. You'll be able to take this from your file and translate it to any application that asks for a housing history that you may be filling out. It's a very good thing to have. I think there's 2 types of people that you're going to run into. One would be people that have always been in the shelter, or at least been in the shelter for 5 years, and there's not much that you can put on this form. I think it's fine to put "I'm homeless," and you can put maybe a contact at the shelter. And I think the flip side of that coin may be you're going to run into people who, seem to change housing every 2 months, either going doubling up to program to shelter, or some variation thereof. And for the past 5 years, they may have 20 or 30 different places that they've been residing, or maybe 2 or 3 different shelters that they stay at simultaneously. Maybe they're not at one shelter all the time, but sort of bop around from place to place. So I think the content of this 5-year history, it's important, but it's also sort of might be it's more it facilitates a discussion with the landlord. I mean, with anything that's on these applications, there's sort of these clues, and then the landlords talk to the people that we work with about sort of what that means or what's on there. There's always, you cannot sort of quantify someone's existence on a form, so don't try. Oh, realistic expectations. Like getting through all this information within 1 hour. I thought that I could, and I know now that that's not going to happen. I think you really also want to talk to the patient about what their day-to-day life will be like once they're housed. This includes the good and the bad. So great, you're getting housed, you'll have a key, you won't be in a shelter with other people, you won't be doubled up with other people. But sort of what's the downside of being housed? And you really want to push people on this because, in terms of sort of quality of life, you want to shoot for a higher percentage of goodness than badness. But it's important for patients to understand that once they're housed, their life will not be 100% sunny and bright all the time. Housing carries its own challenges, and you're doing a disservice if you really don't just get in depth about this with the patients or clients. I'm a big fan of structure in day-to-day life. I think all too often people get into housing and they haven't thought about sort of what they're going to do on this day-to-day basis, and there's no structure. And I think that structure should be synonymous with quality of life, enjoyment, and fulfillment. I think that there's room for the productive and for the recreational. And I think that someone, talking about housing, or especially when someone's about to be housed, it's a good time to sort of set new goals and to really push the patient to think about goals that they may have set aside years ago, especially with some of the older, for people that are long-term survivors, especially people who were diagnosed before there were HIV meds. I think that people really, at a certain point, put some of their goals aside, assuming that they would die. And I think when they're housed, it's time to, to talk to them about that. I've had plenty of patients say, well, I used to want to go to school. And you can say, well, all right, do you think that's a good goal for when you're housed? Although I'm a huge fan of stating the obvious, I try and avoid cliches, but you are never too old to go to school. You are never too old to learn. I think that you can definitely sort of take these turns in your life and embark upon something totally new and unexpected, and it can be wonderful. And you really want to sort of get your patients pumped up for sort of, think about a challenge that you never thought you'd have the opportunity to take on. And then talk to them about whether now is the time to sort of set those goals. Because I think with goals, I'm used to setting, the goals that I set with my patients tend to be half things that they're already doing, continue to show up for appointments, continue to take meds, and then sort of new goals. But the new goals are very sort of they tend to be a collection of lighter goals as opposed to maybe 1 or 2 maybe heavier goals. I would love for people to say, I want to learn how to use computers. Not just sending an email, but I want to learn how to really use computers. Or, I've had patients say, I want to go to school to become a barber, and that is what they did. So we have patients out there that are barbers, but for most of them, it was only after they had sort of a certain amount of stability in their life and were housed and could go to school. I've certainly had homeless patients who went to school and were very successful, but I think housing adds an extra layer of stability. And then, sort of triggers is another good topic to discuss. Stress and relapse. Stress and relapse and boredom seem to be the three that come to mind. Life has its challenging moments. I mean, there are ups and downs on a day-to-day basis. And the two things I prepare patients for, I say, living with neighbors can sometimes be difficult. Not always, but sometimes. And sometimes you're going to wake up and you're going to have a bad day. And maybe that's a day where you want to stay in bed and lay low. There are some days where you wake up and at least for me, I know everything's going to go wrong, so I just assume everything's going to go wrong, and I just try and muddle through until the next day, and then things are better. I think most people have days like that, I hope, I assume. And then you'll want to be discussing sort of how shelter life or life on the streets or life doubled up may differ from life once you're housed. Really focus on challenges and successes in both. The one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of people who have been in shelters for a long time get into their housing and they love their housing and they are just insanely bored or lonely. The one thing the shelters do provide is constant stimulation, and I think sometimes patients aren't prepared for not having that. So you ask the patient, what keeps you sane? And that answer will be very, very different for each person, but it comes back to those social supports. It comes back to the supports that you can provide. And you definitely want to record, when you're talking to a patient about what keeps them sane, record that answer and help patient anticipate and troubleshoot difficult situations before they happen. Again, you want to be as proactive as possible and encourage the patient to be as proactive as possible. You're still going to have curveballs. But if you talk about sort of what a challenge is and it happens, you can say, look, I know we talked about this, and unfortunately it's here right now. So when we talked about it, this is what you said. So let's get to it. And then again, coming back to this payee service, I don't know if you guys have payee services in your area. In Boston, there's a number of different places that will manage patients or clients' money for them for a small fee. Sometimes there are churches that will do it for free. When someone's homeless and they don't have rent to pay, it's really not as much of an issue. When someone's housed, if they think it's a good idea and if it would help them, it's definitely a great thing to offer, because getting that rent paid and sort of, that's part of rebuilding your credit history, is paying that rent in a timely fashion. Anything, if you pitch it as a supportive service instead of a punishment. I think there are cases where Social Security has demanded people have payees, and in that case where there's no choice involved, the patient totally feels slighted, and I understand why. So talk to them about it and offer it, and find out what resources for payees are in your area. So yeah, you know what? So we're gonna sort of chop off the end of this, and we're gonna skip to the end. So I think I just spoke for 55 minutes straight. You can hear my voice getting a little ragged. And I'm going to assume that I want to thank you for listening, and I'm going to assume it's not just because you're on mute. But we want to skip to the end because, so one thing that came up is really, really important is working together on various tools that can help our patients, and also working with patients on developing these tools. So say that you have a patient that you're working with on housing. You're going to need to come up with a list of things the patient will need for their housing. And when you come up with that list, you're going to need to sort of prioritize what's essential versus, sort of what can wait. Because, building a home is a process. So I think even, things like these checklists or reminders or lists of important contacts, lists of social supports. I think there's a really good opportunity here for us to work together to build tools that we can just print out for our patients, these templates that we can modify to suit the patient's needs. So when we have our next gathering in Washington, D.C., some of you will be there, and we definitely want to sit down face-to-face and work on creating these tools. But again, we have this bulletin board / message board where we also have the opportunity to throw out some ideas here and start crafting it and being proactive ourselves. So there's a bunch of different components to these webinars, and I want people to start thinking now about tools, print tools that we could create for our patients. It would really enhance their quality of life. As I said earlier, we all do the same thing, and we do it in many wonderful different ways. So we're going to really need everyone's input. And also, resources vary from location to location. So again, everyone's expertise is required. And thank you for listening to me today. I hope it was useful for you. And if we have any questions, I mean, we can certainly take them right now.
Star 6. So if you're interested in asking, if you want to ask a question on the phone, Star 6 will unmute your line, or you can type in a question in the chat box, or comment.
And also, while we're waiting for people to think of questions or to type in questions, during the upcoming segments of this webinar, I think there's a great opportunity for people to share some of their stories. I think the pre-housing planning is sort of the hardest and most daunting part. I think future webinars will have a lot more space and will probably be a lot more interactive.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any questions, comments?
The idiot typing the question. And all the slides will be posted after today's webinar. So this couple of slides we weren't able to go through, you'll be able to look through as well. And if you have questions or comments or concerns, the forum will be open and be usable for discussions. So we have one question of, do immigration status come up sometimes, or does someone's immigration status?
Absolutely, it can. I think it really depends on what type of housing the person is applying to. If it's federal housing, absolutely not. If it's state housing, possibly. And then with some landlords, their immigration status is irrelevant, at least in Massachusetts. And then with a lot of rooming houses and sober houses, I think they could care less. But I think a lot of it depends on whether you're sort of applying to a housing authority, or if there's any sort of subsidized rent involved, or if there's any sort of insurance involved.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's actually something I'd really like to hear about from other people at the other sites, because I think the populations differ from area to area, and I just I would imagine San Diego, you probably have a lot of people coming across the border looking for housing. I'd be interested to hear how you house them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No questions?
All right, well, thank you all. We're going to move some of this onto the forum, so you will be receiving some emails from us. We are, as James said, really interested in creating some documents that will be useful to you, but that will live beyond this project, which may include this checklist. We may want to think of some role-playing scenarios to do with patients, or a script to help patients stay on point when they're talking to landlords, and any other documents that you think would be helpful that you've created or would like to build upon for this project. We would love to help you with that. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and we will send out an email and information about the next call in the next few days. Have a great day, everyone.